So you ever notice how betrayal doesn't scream when it enters your life? It whispers, it crawls into the quiet spaces of trust, and it waits for you to look away before it sinks its teeth in. That's exactly how it started with my brother. To the world, we were inseparable. Two sides of the same coin, bound by blood and childhood memories, laughing in old photographs and walking shoulder to shoulder at family gatherings. But behind the laughter, there was a shadow in his eyes, something cold and sharp, like a knife hidden beneath the folds of a velvet cloth. I didn't see it at first, not when he borrowed my ideas and called them his own, not when he twisted my words in front of our parents to make me look careless, not even when he started spreading subtle rumors among friends about how I wasn't as trustworthy as I appeared. I brushed it all off as sibling rivalry, the kind we all joke about, until the day I stumbled upon something I was never meant to see, a file, a plan, a collection of carefully fabricated lies typed neatly on his laptop, outlining step by step how he would ruin me, professionally, personally, financially, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of me but ashes. My chest went hollow, my mouth dry. I scrolled through the words with trembling fingers, each line dripping with malice, each move designed like a chess game where I was the sacrificial pawn. The silence of that night pressed down on me like a coffin lid. My heart hammered against my ribs, a storm trapped inside my body, but I stayed quiet. I didn't rage, I didn't confront him. Instead, I closed the laptop gently, like you'd close the lid on a sleeping snake, and whispered to myself, if he wants war, I'll give him war, but on my terms. And in that moment, beneath the hum of the ceiling fan and the weight of betrayal, I made a vow I would not just survive his plan, I would expose it, strip it bare in front of every single person who thought he was the golden boy, the perfect son, the trustworthy brother. He thought he had written my ending. What he didn't know was that I had just found the beginning of his downfall. So they say the most dangerous enemy is the one who wears the sweetest smile, and my brother had perfected that art. To everyone else, he was the golden boy, the one who always knew the right thing to say, the one who helped our mother carry groceries, who spoke softly to our father when tensions ran high, who charmed relatives with stories and laughter that made them pat his back and call him a blessing. I used to believe that smile too. I used to think it was genuine. But after reading his plan, every grin, every nod, every casual pat on my shoulder felt like a performance staged to fool the audience, while I was the unsuspecting character meant to be sacrificed in the second act. And the brilliance of his scheme was terrifying. He didn't want to strike me outright. No, he wanted to weave a narrative so convincing that when the final blow landed, everyone would believe I had ruined myself. Fake debts tied to my name, false accusations planted like ticking bombs, even carefully worded messages crafted to make it seem like I was betraying friends and family. He wasn't just attacking me. He was rewriting the story of who I was. That's when I realized the danger wasn't just in what he had planned, but in how much everyone trusted him. No one would believe me if I simply screamed, "He's lying." To them, he was the boy who could do no wrong. And that's when the bitterness in my chest hardened into something sharper. Resolve. If he wanted to play the role of the angel while painting me as the villain, I would turn his stage lights against him. I would make the world see what lay beneath the golden mask. But exposing him wouldn't be easy. I couldn't confront him directly. That would give him the chance to play the victim, twist my anger into more fuel for his narrative. No, I needed patience, I needed evidence. And above all, I needed to strike at the exact moment when the mask was most firmly in place. Because nothing shatters louder than a false halo breaking in public. They teach you in movies that revenge is a single, cinematic moment, a shattered glass, a dramatic reveal, but real revenge is quieter, it's scaffolding, it's patience, it's the slow architecture of proof, built where pride and lies once stood. The night I decided to fight back, I became an architect of truth. I started small, like a detective circling a suspect, copies of receipts, time-stamped messages, the way his stories bent around the facts. Tiny inconsistencies that, laid end to end, formed a crooked map leading straight to him. I turned my apartment into a lab of proof, a place where every file had a label and every label had a backup, where my voice notes hid like flares against the dark. I replayed conversations in my head, and then replayed them on my phone, isolating phrases, catching his pauses, the seconds when his practiced charm fell away and the real man slipped through like a shadow. I learned to listen for the things he didn't say. Those silences that scream guilt. I reached out to people he'd touched with his lies, not with accusations, but with questions that felt casual, conversational. "Hey, remember that contract? Who did you say signed it?" And watched their faces shift as memory replaced certainty. Some doors closed, some opened. A former colleague who once admired him returned a hesitant text. There were discrepancies in the invoices. I always thought it was a mistake. A childhood friend sent a photo with a caption that didn't match the memory he'd claimed. Each breadcrumb made me bolder. I also had to be careful. One misstep and he'd spin the whole thing into my instability, my temper, my paranoia. So I learned to be invisible while I moved a neutral voice, a dry question, an innocuous email asking for documentation. People responded to neutrality. It made them drop their guard. And with every dropped guard I gathered more bank statements that didn't align with his stories, messages deleted and then recovered, a scanned copy of an agreement with his signature but not his name, an obvious forgery once you knew to look. I made copies, encrypted them, wrote timelines and connections like a cartographer mapping betrayals. But revenge isn't only proof, it's theater too, and I needed allies who understood the stage. I found them in unlikely places. An aunt who always suspected something but lacked courage, a former partner who had been quietly wronged, a cousin who kept receipts because she was careful by nature. They offered me context, corroboration, and, more importantly, the willingness to listen when I said, "I think he's trying to frame me." Together we rehearsed the quiet steps of exposure. How to present evidence without hysteria, how to control the narrative so that truth would land like a stone in still water and ripple outward. At night, lying awake, I felt both the thrill and the sickness of it. This was no longer just saving myself. This was dismantling the man who had learned to weaponize trust. I reminded myself of the vow I'd whispered the night I found his plan. I will expose him before everyone. The vow hardened into strategy, meticulous, patient, and cold. And somewhere under that careful planning grew a deeper question that I pushed away because it was softer, messier once the mask came off. What would replace it? For now, I set that question aside and focused on the trap, because when you build a floor strong enough, even the golden mask cannot stand without support, and when it collapses, everyone will see the person beneath. Tata, the first real crack appeared not in the documents or the whispers, but in his eyes. Just a flicker, the kind of moment most people would miss. But I caught it because I had been studying him like a hunter studies prey. We were at a family dinner, the table glowing with laughter and candlelight, and he was, as always, the center of attention, telling one of his well-rehearsed stories about how he had helped a friend land a promotion, painting himself as the generous hero. Everyone chuckled, nodded, drank in his performance. But then, I slipped in a question. Casual, innocent on the surface, but sharp enough to slice beneath his rehearsed act. "Didn't you say last month that he was still unemployed?" Must have been a quick turnaround. For a fraction of a second, the mask trembled. His smile froze, his jaw clenched, his eyes darted sideways. And then, like an actor recovering from a forgotten line, he laughed it off, reshaping the story to fit. The others barely noticed, but I did. That was when I knew my plan was working, not because I had exposed him yet, but because I had made him sweat. People who lived behind masks fear the tiniest breeze of doubt, and I was learning how to fan that breeze into a storm. From then on, I kept testing the cracks, asking offhand questions, leaving small hints that I remembered things differently, pulling threads in conversations until the fabric of his lies began to fray. And he noticed. His text to me grew sharper, colder, filled with veiled warnings. "Don't try to make me look bad. Careful with your words. People believe what they hear." It was almost laughable, how the same brother who smiled like a saint in public sent me messages that blood venom in private. But those messages became part of my arsenal, screenshotted, dated, stored. Proof that behind the golden mask was a man already cracking. Meanwhile, my allies, the aunt, the cousin, the ex, were quietly feeding me more thread stories of manipulation, inconsistencies they had dismissed until now. The narrative I was building was no longer mine alone. It was a chorus, voices connecting in harmony, and every note pointed to him. Still, there was danger. He was clever, always a step ahead, and when he sensed that people were beginning to question him, he doubled down on the performance. He showered our parents with attention, volunteered to run errands, praised me in front of others as though we were still the closest of friends. It was nauseating, watching him polish the halo while the cracks spread beneath it. But I let him. Because I knew halos don't shatter from one blow, they shatter from pressure, from the weight of lies pressing in, until they collapse under their own gravity. And all I had to do was keep pressing. The storm was building, and though no one else saw it yet, I could already hear the rumble of thunder. Tada revenge isn't just about exposing someone, it's about timing, and by the time the leaves outside our house had turned brittle with autumn, the timing felt ripe. I had spent weeks weaving the threads tighter, nudging stories, planting quiet seeds of doubt, and now, without realizing it, my brother was watering them himself. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more desperate he looked to the trained eye. He over-explained small details. He circled back to stories no one had asked to hear again. He threw my name into conversations where it didn't belong, as if preemptively defending himself against accusations no one had yet made. To everyone else, it was still invisible. But to me, it was thunder echoing across a sky before the lightning strikes. I started to orchestrate subtle tests with the help of my allies. My cousin invited him into a casual conversation about an event we all attended years ago, and asked about a minor detail that he had twisted in his grand retellings. When he stumbled, fumbling over a correction, she looked at him with raised brows and later whispered to me, "He's slipping." My aunt, always sharp with memory, began asking him innocently phrased questions about old financial dealings, her tone syrup, sweet, while her eyes dug for inconsistencies, and oh did she find them. And then came the biggest tremor. The ex-partner, who had once been silenced by his charm and manipulation, finally found her courage. She showed me a chain of old messages, proof of the way he had cornered her into a deal that left her financially bruised while he walked away clean. "I never thought anyone would believe me," she confessed, her hands trembling as she passed the phone. "But if you're gathering proof, then let this be part of it." That night, as I sifted through the evidence piling higher and higher, I realized the balance of power was shifting. For the first time I wasn't the one being hunted, I was the hunter. Still, danger loomed. My brother wasn't blind. He could feel the shift even if he couldn't see the net tightening. His messages turned darker, sharper. "You're playing with fire. You don't know what I'm capable of." But those words didn't scare me anymore. They confirmed what I already knew. He was rattled. And when people like him get rattled, they make mistakes. I just had to be ready to catch them. I imagined the confrontation, no, the unveiling. It would have to be public, undeniable. A place where his golden mask would be polished brightest, so that the cracks would blind everyone when they split open. And in my mind, I already saw the setting: a family gathering, voices and laughter, the perfect stage. A storm doesn't announce itself quietly, it comes when the skies are at their most deceptively calm, and I was ready. Senda, the day of the gathering, came draped in the kind of deceptive warmth that makes people believe nothing could go wrong. Sunlight spilling through the curtains, the smell of roasted food drifting from the kitchen, relatives chatting in little clusters, laughter bouncing off the walls. To everyone else, it was a celebration. To me, it was theater, and every plate of food, every glass of water, every smile was part of the stage where my brother's golden mask would finally break. He was in his element, of course, floating from group to group, shaking hands, offering compliments, laughing too loud at his own jokes. The halo was gleaming, polished to perfection. I watched him carefully, noting how he leaned closer to our parents, how he played the dutiful son, whispering reassurances that I knew were meant to seed doubts about me. But he didn't know that I had already shifted the ground beneath his feet. My allies were scattered around the room, my cousin by the window, my aunt near the kitchen, the ex-partner just arriving with a folder tucked under her arm. They gave me brief nods, subtle, almost invisible, but enough to remind me I wasn't alone. The moment came sooner than I expected. My brother raised his glass for a toast, and with that well-practiced voice of his, he launched into a speech about family, loyalty, and trust. He looked directly at me as he said it, his smile dagger sharp, his words dipped in honey but edged with poison. People clapped. Our parents beamed, and I felt the blood in my veins thrum like drums of war. That's when I stood slowly, deliberately, my own glass untouched. The room quieted, expecting me to echo his toast, but instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a single folder, thick and heavy with the proof of months of quiet labor. My voice didn't shake, it rang with a calm steel I hadn't felt before. "Family is built on trust," I said, my eyes never leaving his. "But what happens when trust is betrayed? Not by outsiders, but by one of our own." A ripple went through the room, confusion, curiosity, unease. My brother chuckled, tried to play it off, but I saw it. The tiniest twitch in his jaw, the flicker of fear in his eyes. That was the first crack the whole family finally saw. And in that silence, that moment where all eyes turned to me, I knew the storm had begun, and there would be no going back. The silence that followed my words was suffocating, like the room itself had inhaled and refused to exhale. My brother, ever the performer, let out a laugh that was a shade too high, a touch too strained. "Oh, come on," he said, eyes flicking nervously around the room. "Don't tell me you're going to start another one of your dramatic stories." He expected chuckles, expected the audience to follow his cue as always, but the room stayed quiet. My aunt's gaze was fixed on me, my cousin leaned forward, and even my parents tilted their heads in wary curiosity. That silence was my signal. I slid the first page from the folder onto the table. Face up, the words bold and unmistakable, a forged document with my name scrawled in handwriting that wasn't mine. Gasps trickled like water in a leaking pipe. "This," I said evenly, "was supposed to prove I owed money to people I'd never met. Convenient, isn't it, that the handwriting matches yours, brother?" His smile faltered, lips twitching as though searching for a defense, but I didn't give him space. I laid down another page and another, screenshots of messages he thought deleted, whispers of manipulation, proof of debts and lies he had crafted not just against me but against others. Each page landed like a hammer on glass. The ex-partner stepped forward then, voice trembling but strong. "He did it to me too." I stayed quiet because no one believed me, but it's all here. She placed her folder beside mine, her evidence merging with mine until it was undeniable. A mountain of truth too heavy to dismiss. My brother's mask was slipping faster than he could glue it back on. His laughter turned brittle, sharp-edged. "This is ridiculous, you're all being manipulated. Can't you see? He's twisting everything." His eyes darted wildly, looking for allies, for someone to nod, to defend him, but the faces that once glowed with trust now flickered with doubt. My cousin spoke, calm but cutting. "Then explain why the details don't match. Why you've told different versions of the same story for years." My aunt added, "And why these receipts don't align with the bank statements." I checked. The room was no longer his stage, it was his trial. And I was no longer the brother in his shadow, I was the prosecutor pulling back the curtain. The halo he had polished so carefully was cracking, and for the first time in his life, he had no script to hide behind. He stood there exposed, floundering, eyes burning into mine with a hatred so raw I almost pitied him. Almost. It was like watching a dam burst, years of carefully constructed walls cracking under the pressure of truth until the floodwaters broke loose. My brother's charm, his practiced composure, it all disintegrated in front of our family's eyes. He slammed his glass down so hard the stem snapped, wine spilling across the table like blood and water. His voice, once honey, now thunder. "You think you're better than me. You think you can turn them against me." His mask was gone, ripped off by his own rage, and what lay beneath was ugly. Raw jealousy, bitterness that had festered for years, now screaming in the open. The room recoiled. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, my father's jaw clenched in silent fury. He pointed at me, spit flying with every word. Everything he has should have been mine. The job, the respect, the way you all look at him. It should have been me. So what if I twisted things? So what if I made him look bad? He's weak. He doesn't deserve any of it. His voice cracked, his chest heaving, and in that moment the halo shattered completely. There was no going back, no salvaging the image of the golden sun. My aunt whispered, "Dear God." My cousin muttered, "I knew something was wrong." And the ex-partner, trembling but unyielding, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "He ruined lives while you all looked away." My brother's eyes darted, desperate, searching for sympathy, for a lifeline, but found only silence. The people he had manipulated, lied to, charmed. They were seeing him for the first time, not as the savior but as the snake. And then, in the stillness that followed his outburst, I stepped closer, my voice calm, almost too calm. "You wanted to ruin me. But all you did was reveal yourself." His face twisted, part rage, part despair, part recognition that the game was over. The silence in the room was heavier than any scream, because silence meant judgment, and judgment was final. My parents' eyes, once full of pride for him, were now heavy with shame. That was the moment I knew the revenge was complete. Not because I had shouted, not because I had destroyed him with my hands, but because he had destroyed himself in the spotlight I turned on him. The room felt colder after his outburst, as though the very walls had absorbed the venom in his words and shuddered from it. My brother stood there, chest heaving, eyes darting like a trapped animal, but no one rushed to comfort him, no one defended him. The silence was worse than anger, it was judgment, heavy and suffocating. My father was the first to speak, his voice a low, controlled thunder that carried more weight than a shout. "Enough." Just that one word, and it was as if the ground shifted beneath us. My mother couldn't even look at him. Her tears streamed silently, falling onto her clasped hands. My aunt crossed her arms, her disappointment sharp as a blade. My cousin shook her head slowly, whispering, all these years. And the ex-partner, who had once been a silent victim, finally straightened her back, her voice steady as she said, now they all see what you really are. My brother tried to salvage it, scrambling with excuses. It was pressure, it was stress. I didn't mean. But the words were too late, too hollow, too poisoned. Every sentence only tightened the noose of his own making. I didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't throw his own words back at him. I simply gathered the folder of evidence and closed it, the snap of the cover echoing like a verdict. This ends tonight, I said quietly, and that quietness cut sharper than any scream could have. He looked at me then, and for the first time in my life, there was no mask, no charm, just naked hatred laced with fear. He left that night, storming out into the darkness, his footsteps echoing against the pavement like the retreat of a fallen king. No one followed him. No one called after him. He had written his own exile with every lie, every betrayal, every false word. The family didn't need convincing anymore. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, heard it with their own ears. And as I stood in that heavy silence, I realized revenge isn't loud. It's the quiet collapse of someone's empire, brick by brick, until there's nothing left but ashes. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was release, like a chain I'd carried for years had finally broken, leaving behind scars but also freedom. My brother had planned to ruin me, but in the end, he had only destroyed himself. Tata Zhao, they say revenge tastes sweet, but in truth, it tastes like silence, like the kind that lingers after a storm when the air is heavy with what has been broken. In the weeks that followed, the family tried to stitch itself back together, but there was no ignoring the absence where my brother once stood. His calls went unanswered, his excuses fell on deaf ears, and the golden reputation he had polished for so long lay in ruins at his own feet. I didn't chase him, didn't try to mend what he had shattered, because some betrayals carve wounds too deep for repair, and some masks, once broken, can never be worn again. Instead, I focused on reclaiming what he tried to steal: my name, my truth, my peace. And slowly, the whispers that once circled me with doubt transformed into respect. Relatives who had believed his stories now looked at me with new eyes, not as the sibling in the shadows, but as the one who stood in the fire and refused to burn. But here's the truth that gnawed at me in the quiet hours: revenge doesn't erase the scars. It doesn't undo the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd already lost, or the years of being the target of his envy. What it does is restore balance, reminding the world, and me, that lies cannot hold forever, that truth, though slower, is inevitable. And maybe that's the real justice, not his downfall, but the fact that I no longer lived under the weight of his schemes. He had wanted me ruined, erased, forgotten. Instead, he became the cautionary tale, and I became the voice that would not be silenced. If this were a story told to strangers, they'd call it poetic justice. To me, it was survival. And as I sit here, telling it aloud, I can almost hear the echoes of that night. The glass shattering, the silence after his confession, the heavy weight of truth settling over the room. My brother's secret plan to ruin me had failed, but more than that, it had backfired, leaving him alone in the ashes of his own deceit. And so I close this chapter not with triumph, but with a steady truth. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. It's about pulling away their mask and letting the world see who they really are. And once the world sees, there's no going back. That was my justice. That was my freedom. They say revenge tastes sweet, but in truth, it tastes like silence, like the kind that lingers after a storm when the air is heavy with what has been broken. In the weeks that followed, the family tried to stitch itself back together, but there was no ignoring the absence where my brother once stood. His calls went unanswered, his excuses fell on deaf ears, and the golden reputation he had polished for so long lay in ruins at his own feet. I didn't chase him, didn't try to mend what he had shattered, because some betrayals carve wounds too deep for repair, and some masks, once broken, can never be worn again. Instead, I focused on reclaiming what he tried to steal: my name, my truth, my peace. And slowly, the whispers that once circled me with doubt transformed into respect. Relatives who had believed his stories now looked at me with new eyes, not as the sibling in the shadows, but as the one who stood in the fire and refused to burn. But here's the truth that gnawed at me in the quiet hours: revenge doesn't erase the scars. It doesn't undo the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd already lost, or the years of being the target of his envy. What it does is restore balance, reminding the world, and me, that lies cannot hold forever, that truth though slower is inevitable. And maybe that's the real justice, not his downfall, but the fact that I no longer lived under the weight of his schemes. He had wanted me ruined, erased, forgotten. Instead, he became the cautionary tale, and I became the voice that would not be silenced. If this were a story told to strangers, they'd call it poetic justice. To me it was survival, and as I sit here, telling it aloud, I can almost hear the echoes of that night, the glass shattering, the silence after his confession, the heavy weight of truth settling over the room. My brother's secret plan to ruin me had failed, but more than that, it had backfired, leaving him alone in the ashes of his own deceit. And so I close this chapter not with triumph, but with a steady truth. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone. It's about pulling away their mask and letting the world see who they really are. And once the world sees, there's no going back. That was my justice. That was my freedom. Tata, they say revenge tastes sweet, but in truth, it tastes like silence, like the kind that lingers after a storm when the air is heavy with what has been broken. In the weeks that followed, the family tried to stitch itself back together, but there was no ignoring the absence where my brother once stood. His calls went unanswered, his excuses fell on deaf ears, and the golden reputation he had polished for so long lay in ruins at his own feet. I didn't chase him, didn't try to mend what he had shattered, because some betrayals carve wounds too deep for repair, and some masks once broken can never be worn again. Instead, I focused on reclaiming what he tried to steal: my name, my truth, my peace, and slowly, the whispers that once circled me with doubt transformed into respect. Relatives who had believed his stories now looked at me with new eyes, not as the sibling in the shadows, but as the one who stood in the fire and refused to burn. But here's the truth that gnawed at me in the quiet hours: revenge doesn't erase the scars. It doesn't undo the nights I lay awake wondering if I'd already lost, or the years of being the target of his envy. What it does is restore balance, reminding the world, and me, that lies cannot hold forever, that truth though slower is inevitable. And maybe that's the real justice, not his downfall, but the fact that I no longer lived under the weight of his schemes. He had wanted me ruined, erased, forgotten. Instead, he became the cautionary tale, and I became the voice that would not be silenced. If this were a story told to strangers, they'd call it poetic justice. To me, it was survival, and as I sit here, telling it aloud, I can almost hear the echoes of that night, the glass shattering, the silence after his confession, the heavy weight of truth settling over the room. My brother's secret plan to ruin me had failed, but more than that, it had backfired, leaving him alone in the ashes of his own deceit. And so I close this chapter not with triumph, but with a steady truth. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone, it's about pulling away their mask and letting the world see who they really are. And once the world sees, there's no going back. That was my justice. That was my freedom.